Irvine. He's a political theorist who writes on issues of popular and insurgent politics, post-coloniality, cultural politics, post-structuralism, and critical theory. Olson is the author of Imagined Sovereignties, The Power of the People and Other Myths of the Modern Age, published by Cambridge in 2016, Reflexive Democracy, Political Equality and Welfare State, published by the MIT in 2006, and the editor of Adding Insult to Injury by Nancy Fraser Debates Her Critics, published by Verso in 2008. Olson's current research focuses on the cultural and normative basis of popular politics. It examines the complex ways that ideas such as the power of the people, the public sphere, and speaking the truth to power inhabit our collective imagination. He's now finishing a book manuscript called Subaltern Silence, a post-colonial genealogy. His presentation today derives from his book. I must add, he's one of the most brilliant and creative minds in contemporary critical theory, conducting innovative and systematic research on relevant topics for nowadays politics. So it is a great honor to have him here, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you again. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ricardo, for the invitation and for that incredible introduction. I'm very grateful to be able to talk to you. I'm very grateful for the warm and kind words as well. So let me, as one does these days, I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen. So let me just take a moment to do that. Okay. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. And now I will go to the beginning of the presentation. So as Ricardo said, this is very much work in progress. And I'm really delighted to have you all be able to see it. I'm delighted to be able to share some of this new work that I've been doing. And I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and your thoughts and questions about it. So this particular presentation is one chapter in the book. And as Ricardo said, this is a book that's called Subaltern Silence, a Postcolonial Genealogy. This particular chapter is Phantasmatic Public Spheres, the Paranoid Style in French Colonialism. If it's not clear why I've titled it that, it'll become clear in just a moment. So my jumping off point for the book as a whole is very much Gayatri Spivak's quite famous paper, originally a conference presentation and then a paper called Can the Subaltern Speak? And this is from 1983. And Spivak was simply asked to present a paper at a conference on Marxism at the University of Illinois in 1983. This was her contribution, but it really became a kind of landmark piece of work, very path-breaking work that wound up, in fact, launching 1,000 research programs as a result. So not only hers, but many other people. Spivak herself then modified this in 1999 and built an entire, quite a substantial book out of this idea of subaltern speech. And so the book is a critique of post-colonial reason from 1999. The idea is essentially to ask this, I mean, it was seemingly a very simple question. So can the subaltern speak? The question that Spivak is really posing here is, are there forms of subordination that are so complete that we're not even aware of them? So we're used to talking about subaltern politics. There had been this tradition of the subaltern studies movement, particularly in India, that grew out of Gramsci before Spivak. So this was already converting Gramsci into a kind of a study of subaltern politics against colonialism in India. And Spivak really turned all of this on its head, and she asked, could there be examples of people who are so thoroughly subordinated that we're not even aware of them? They're so thoroughly marginalized, so thoroughly pushed to the margins that they completely fall out of our awareness. They, in effect, become silent. And of course, speech and silence here is a metaphor for much more complicated issues. It's a metaphor for epistemological problems, really. And those are problems, as I said, of membership, of marginality, of presence, agency, or incomprehension of others, really. So that's the stake in what she's doing. Now, I'm very impressed by this work, as are many others. I think it asks some very profound questions and poses some very profound problems. So I think the basic idea is quite brilliant, but I also think it's not very well elaborated. That Spivak provides important examples of subaltern speech or its lack, subaltern silence, but they remain kind of disconnected examples. She really doesn't give us a broader analysis of this phenomenon that she's trying to describe. And so the way I like to put the point is it suffers from a kind of pointillism. And what I mean by that is this sort of, you get these moments of insight from each of the particular examples, but there isn't really a kind of broader analysis of how subordination is constituted, how it shifts over time, how different kinds of people can be obscured or rediscovered, how their subordination can be contested. So there's a problem of a kind of having a broader scale analysis that can understand the problem and then observe subtle shifts over time. Now, that clearly then is the agenda that I'm giving to myself. So the book that I'm describing, and this is, I should say, it's a manuscript that's basically finished. I'm kind of reworking things. So I'm, again, delighted to have your thoughts on it. My project is very much to try to fill in the lacks and the gaps and the problems that I see in Spivak in what I'm calling a genealogy of subaltern silence. And so genealogy here is obviously a kind of critical history indebted to Michel Foucault. And what I'm trying to do is look at this phenomenon of subalternity. So in other words, the ways in which different kinds of people are subordinated, and particularly the ways that they can be so thoroughly subordinated, as Spivak describes it, that they're just pushed to the margins and they kind of disappear from view in society. And I'm calling that subaltern silence. So what I'm trying to do is essentially write a critical history of that phenomenon. The conditions under which it occurs are obviously part of what I'm very interested in. And then I want to document the kind of changing scene of subaltern silence over time, as well as the fine kind of qualitative character of this phenomenon. So how does it change? How is it constituted? How is it contested? How does it change over time? So that's really the challenge that I'm trying to give myself. Now, unlike a lot of Spivak's work, I'm rooting this in a kind of very careful archival history, as I said. The book as a whole covers 150 years of Haitian history. So I'm looking at a very particular context, namely French colonialism in the Caribbean in the 18th and 19th centuries, focusing in particular on the most prominent French colony at that time, which was known as Saint-Domingue. It later became the country we know as Haiti. And so I'm looking at both its colonial history and its post-colonial history. Today, what I want to talk about is a smaller part of that. So this is the shift immediately from that colonial context to the post-colonial context. And so where we go from colonial Saint-Domingue to revolutionary Haiti, this is roughly, so the Haitian Revolution is 1791 to 1804. So this would be a period just before that, in the 1780s, really the 1770s even, up to the early 1800s. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And it goes from being a story about the fear of a potential revolution in the French colony, and it ends as a story about who should be blamed once that revolution actually happens. So that's the movement that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, this particular research for the chapter that I'm discussing right now mostly was conducted in the French National Archives in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine. This is the new French archive building that was built a couple of years ago north of Paris. and then also in the French colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence in southern France. So a lot of the material about this time period, because it's still the period of coloniality and revolution, it's largely in France. Okay, so first time period, call this the period of abolitionism. And so this is the 1770s, the 1780s. This phrase I'm using, abolitionism, obviously refers to the movement to abolish slavery. And so this was one of the kind of great intellectual projects of the Enlightenment in 18th century France, England, and the United States. It was a significant preoccupation of a lot of Enlightenment thinkers at the time. Slavery was highly controversial. One very prominent example of this is a book, or I should say set of books, published by the abbé, so the abbé, the priest, Guillaume Thomas Raynal, who edited together a collection of materials in about 10 volumes that was published in 1770 and then republished over and over and over again. It was a very, very popular work that went through many editions. With a very long title. I'm not going to read you the whole title. It's always referred to as Histoire des deux Indes, so the history of the two Indies. Of course, in other words, the West Indies and the East Indies. But really, it's a history of colonialism in the 18th century. And so what Raynal was trying to do is give a kind of panoptical account of everything that one might want to know about coloniality and the project of European colonialism as it existed at that point. So there's a lot of stuff in there about colonial governance, about economics, about how to promote agriculture, very kind of tedious details. But there are also some very, very historically important passages supporting the abolition of slavery. And the most famous of these is one I'll read to you. And I should say I'm translating into English. Forgive me. Unfortunately, I can't translate into Portuguese. And maybe leaving it in French would have been more helpful. I'm not sure. But just the book is English, so this is what you get. So all of the translations that I'll be giving you in the rest of the presentation are all my own translations from French to English. This is a very famous passage. It has been cited by many other people since then, and it was thought to be very influential in eventually promoting the waves of anti-colonial revolution that occurred across the world in this decades and centuries after Raynal. I'll just say briefly, the word nègre in French was used in very important ways during the history of coloniality and slavery in France. And it doesn't have a good translation into English. So it's a word that I leave purposely in French. At this time, it means both a Black person and slave, but in varying degrees of meaning that change over this time period. And so that's one of the things I actually talk about in the book. But this is just a kind of an explanation here. So the term isn't translated in what I'm going to read. So here's Raynal, volume 6 from the Histoire des deux Indes. The nègres lack only a leader courageous enough to guide them to vengeance and carnage. Where is he, this great man, whom nature owes to its vexed, oppressed, and tormented children? Where is he? He will appear without doubt. He will reveal himself. He will raise the sacred standard of liberty. This venerable signal will gather his companions in misfortune around him. More impetuous than the torrents, they will leave everywhere the indelible traces of their just resentment. So you can see why this passage became famous. It's very, very strong rhetoric. It's a very strong indictment of slavery, and correspondingly a kind of really almost an incitement to revolution. And so this Raynal was a very controversial figure as a result. And of course, abolition as an intellectual movement was also very controversial. Another great figure in the abolitionist movement again in France is Jacques-Pierre Blisso. And Blisso wasn't an author of works the way Raynal was. He was much more of a practical politician. So he was the founder of the most important abolitionist group in France in the 18th century, called the Société des Amis des Noirs, or the Society of Friends of Blacks. And so this was a group organized to promote the abolition of slavery, founded in 1788. Blisso also was a publisher. So he founded probably the leading, or one of the leading, political journals of the French Revolution, called Le Patriote François, which was a very important political journal starting up around the time of the French Revolution in 1789. And so Blisso, in addition to organizing this abolition group, was also a leading participant in the growing public spheres of his day, in essentially the new modern press of the 18th century. And then if that wasn't enough, he was also the founder and leader of one of the major political factions in French politics after the French Revolution. It became one of the dominant political factions in the French National Assembly and the Constitutional Assembly, the drafting of the French Constitution. So this group was called the Girondins, and they were essentially constitutionalist liberals. So it was that wing of French post-revolutionary politics. And Blisso was very effective as an abolitionist because he was such an effective politician. So Raynal was, the person I just talked about, of course, was very famous as a writer. Blisso actually had the ability and the means to start to make meaningful political and legal change, to actually start a movement to abolish slavery because of his political acumen and his political position. And also his pivotal point in this global new international public sphere that was developing around abolition and between the various abolitionist movements of England, France, and the United States. And so this included people like Blisso, but also a very famous figure in the United States, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Clarkson, who was a great English abolitionist. So the movement went from being a kind of intellectual movement, or a purely intellectual movement, to something with very practical political traction as well. Okay, so let's move on slightly to essentially, so 1789 to 1791, if you're familiar with this history, this is the period from the French Revolution to the start of the Haitian Revolution. There's only a 2-year gap between those two things. And I'm calling this a shifting landscape of fear. Now, the fear I'm talking about is the fear that colonial plantation owners started to experience when they imagined what might happen if the ideas of the abolitionists ever reached their island, and particularly if they reached the enslaved people on the island. So they saw the doctrines of abolition as potentially very threatening even in terms of the politics of France, where there might actually be a legislative movement to abolish slavery. But even worse, they thought, what would happen if the slaves themselves ever got a hold of these writings? And this fear provoked a great deal of controversy. So, for instance, in 1789, again, the year of the French Revolution, we have this address addressed to the French National Assembly. It's signed by 84 colonial property owners from Bordeaux. And to anyone who's familiar with the archives of the French Revolution, this looks immediately familiar because it's printed in the style of a French revolutionary pamphlet. So it looks like the pamphlets that were distributed to spur the French Revolution on. But of course, this is not about the French Revolution, actually anti-revolutionary in the sense that it's seeking to prevent a revolution in the colonies. Okay, so it's in a kind of very interesting way, it's echoing the form of a revolutionary pamphlet in a kind of counter-revolutionary sense, attacking abolition. Okay, that's really what's going on here. And so the authors, these 84 landowners, say the following things. And again, I'm translating here. We are surrounded by the cruelest fear. At the moment of losing all of our goods, shaking at the deplorable fate of our families, of our compatriots, menaced like us in their property, in their lives, in their honor. They are currently terror-stricken by the destructive plagues hovering above their heads, menaced by fire, iron, poison, afflicted by the terrible future that presents itself to them. Okay, now you might ask the authors, so what is the source of this fear of losing all your goods, losing your life, your property? They answer the question this way. Incendiary writings announce every day from all parts of the colony that the disorders are ready to begin again. The horrible plot of these monsters is essentially to destroy all the whites by fire, iron, poison, and to spare only our wives to make them the instrument of their pleasures and their servants. Okay, now, again, so incendiary writings are the cause of this fear of revolution. It is the horrible plot of these monsters. Now, who are the monsters? Remember, there is no revolution in Haiti yet. The monsters are the abolitionists, okay? The ones who write the incendiary writings, people like Blisso, people like Reynal. So they are potentially the cause of this horrible plot that's being described. And obviously, so the rhetoric is very, very strong, very intense here, displaying likely intense emotions that are coming along with this. Now, I'll just say there are many, many other examples of this in the French archives. And in the book, I talk about other ones. I can't go through them all here. What I want to do instead is just talk about the overall kind of movement that's going on. And this is very much, it's a movement against abolition. And here, abolition is often called philanthropy. Okay, which of course in English now has a different meaning, but etymologically in Greek, what it means, of course, is the love of man, which is a good thing in the 18th century normally, but here it's being used as an insult. And so the abolitionists were called philanthropists as a way of insulting them. It had a kind of biting satirical edge when this term was used. And what this meant was a sort of caricature of abolition as a kind of weak-minded universalism that would wreak havoc on the very lucrative colonial economy. And so the idea was these philosophers come along with their crazy ideas like abolish slavery, and they're just so kind of besotted, so taken with the idea of the love of man that they forget how crazy that is. Okay, so it's a kind of parody of abolition. But it's a parody that, again, had real circulation. And so what I'm showing you here is actually a graph of that term philanthropy in French. This is just the number of print instances of philanthropy, of that word, compared with all other words published in French during that time from 1740 to 1810. And what you see is right around the time that I'm talking about, right in the 1780s, 1783, it looks like, there's an enormous increase in attention to this idea of philanthropy. And again, philanthropy is a kind of insult to abolition. So they never refer to abolition as abolition. I think they didn't even want to use that word. They used the insulting, satirical caricature term instead. And it's not a coincidence that this starts in the decade before the Haitian Revolution, and it continues, the controversy about philanthropy continues to increase during the Haitian Revolution itself, peaking in about 1800. So in other words, there's a connection between fear of revolution in the colony and this insulting term for abolition. Now the question is, so why? What's going on there? Here's my hypothesis. the reason philanthropy, the reason abolition becomes so controversial is because the people who are worried about it are chiefly worried about this fear they have, an imagination and fear of public spheres that might connect European abolitionists and colonial slaves. So what they're afraid of when they talk about philanthropy, it's not the abolitionists and their writings itself. It's about the potential circulation of those writings into the colonies through this public sphere that they're imagining, that they're afraid of. Okay. And so this is my explanation for why philanthropy becomes such a controversial term. Now, where am I getting that explanation? By reading the documents that talk about philanthropy. Okay, and so the way I like to talk about this is to call this imagination and fear of a public sphere for which there's no evidence, at least yet. I call that the phantasmatic public sphere. And what I mean by that, of course, is it's a phantasm in the sense of like a ghost or an imaginary being, a fantasy of some kind, something that you think might exist, you're afraid it exists, but you don't have any evidence that it exists. And so here, I think this imagined public sphere between abolitionists and slaves, or the idea that it could exist, that is the thing that's the phantasm in this case. So it's a very abstract entity. It's something that's imagined as a domain of publicity. It's the hypothetical and fearful postulation of publicity that connects slaves and abolitionists, or that might connect them. So here, I mean, I think what's really happening is the colonial elites, the landowners, they're aware of the European public sphere around abolition. And what they're really afraid of is that public sphere being extended into the colonies and to the slaves. Okay, now, why is this important? I think it's important because the fear becomes a driver of events in itself. It actually becomes a very important phenomenon within the colonies. This fear, I think, this fear of a public sphere becomes highly paranoid. And people start imagining not just the existence of the public sphere, but potentially whole conspiracies, hidden domains of action. And to think about this, I like to go back to a very famous piece by Richard Hofstadter from 1964. And this is something that we've been talking a lot about in the United States recently with our own politics and the politics of the US in the past 4 years or so. The piece is called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And it was originally a reference to Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was in the 50s in the United States, conducting Senate hearings to try to find communists within the government. And so there was this great paranoia about the potential for communist infiltration. And this has, it has some very interesting things to say about politics in general and what happens when they become paranoid. And I like to use this as a metaphor for similar fears, similar paranoid anxieties happening in the French colonies in the 18th century. And so this obviously is where my subtitle comes from, the paranoid style in French colonialism. So it's a reference to Hofstadter. Now, an important part of my story here is about the character of paranoia. So how does paranoia work? And one of the things I really like about Hofstadter is he treats it as a political and social phenomenon. So he's not interested in the individual sort of clinical manifestations of paranoia, which is how you might normally think about it. He's viewing it as a kind of social phenomenon that goes across an entire society, or at least part of a society. And I want to pick up that inspiration as well. So here's some insights that I've developed about the way I think paranoia is working in French colonialism at this time. So above all, what I see there is a kind of ambivalence. So paranoia is, I think, fundamentally ambivalent, at least in this context. And what I mean by ambivalence here is that it holds in place contradictory and very different ideas, and it freezes them in place. So it suspends them in contradiction with one another. And so the ambivalence is precisely the inability to decide one way or another about the various things that one is paranoid of. Okay, so the paranoid envisions potential harms. There's this thing of this object of fear. And because it's an object of fear, the paranoid very much wants that fear to remain unrealized. Now, on the other hand, being paranoid is a very uncomfortable state. And so there's a different current of paranoia where the paranoid also wants to get this over with, wants to stop being in fear. So in other words, this would involve actually kind of seeing how things turn out, like potentially realizing one's fear. But that's also bad. So it's bad to actualize the object of your fear. It's bad, on the other hand, to remain in fear. And so there's a kind of vacillation or an ambivalence between those two states. Now, similarly, the paranoid would really like to know whether there is something to fear. Okay, am I correct to be afraid? On the other hand, maybe you don't want to know, right? Because the answer might be yes, you should be afraid because something bad is about to happen. And so again, there's a vacillation or an ambivalence between wanting to know and not wanting to know. The paranoid very much wants to be wrong about the necessity of fear. And being wrong here, of course, means there was nothing to fear. What a relief. I didn't have to be afraid. But of course, what that means is you were wrong, right? So you were in this paranoid state. You were upset for no reason. You imagined the thing you were afraid of. It never really existed. And so on the other hand, you kind of want to be right. You want to be able to say, see, I was right to be afraid. And so again, this is another form of ambivalence that I think is deeply structured into paranoia in these situations. Now, what that means then is essentially paranoia has this kind of ambivalence that just, it's part of the phenomenon of fear and fear becoming untethered from reality, fear spurring your imagination onwards, that it becomes a phenomenon that kind of feeds on itself. And it feeds on itself in the sense that ambivalence is connected to the imagination, right? So you imagine something that you potentially are afraid of. It could occur in the future. You develop fear and then paranoia about that, which, as I've said, is highly ambivalent. Now, in fixating on that object of fear, in focusing on it, in thinking about whether or not you really should be afraid of it, your imagination becomes more and more and more entrenched. So the object of imagination seems more and more real. Now, the more and more real that object of imagination seems, the more fear it causes. So there's a kind of perverse dynamic between those two things. So the ambivalence of paranoia feeds the imagination, and imagination feeds the paranoia. Now, in the case I've been talking about in the French colonies, we have this imagination and fear of a public sphere that might connect abolitionists and slaves. And I think this has the same structure. So what happens is nobody really knows whether there's this phantasmatic public sphere or not. It's a hypothesis. It's an object of fear. The more and more people fear it, the more real it seems. So imagination and paranoia reinforce one another, and the phantasmatic public sphere becomes more and more and more real in people's imagination. So this is again, now I'm just operating from these documents that I've been reading in the archives, but this is my interpretation of what's going on there. Why it is that fear of abolition becomes such an enormous issue for them. Okay, so this paranoid ambivalence about the public sphere it's populated by what I would call 4 figures. Okay, so the first of those is the person we could call the silent slave. And what I mean by this is the slavery enslaved people in the French colonies were silenced on purpose, right? That was just part of the way in which they were enslaved. They were silenced by violence, they were silenced by law. Okay, so the silent slave is one of the figures that's being imagined here as part of this public sphere. Now, the other person who comes on the scene is the European abolitionists. So people like Reynal, people like Blisso speak for the slaves. They condemn slavery. They speak out for the abolition of slavery. Okay, so that's another prominent figure in this scene. The phantasmatic public sphere, then, is the domain in which these 2 other figures would come into contact with one another and come into communication with one another. So the silent slave, the silenced slave, the slave who's silenced by violence and law, would gain access to the ideas of European abolitionists through a phantasmatic public sphere. Now, the question is, why does this provoke paranoia and fear? And I think the answer is a 4th figure, namely, the silent slave would turn out to be not really silent, but actually what we could call an incitable, potentially insurgent slave. And what I mean by that is this person who was thought to have been subordinated, thought to have been thoroughly enslaved, could, by exposure to abolitionist ideas, turn out to be incitable to revolution, could become an insurgent. And so that, of course, is really the fear. So it's the fear that the phantasmatic public sphere would convert silent slaves into incitable, potentially insurgent ones. And I think this explains the great fear attached to the phantasmatic public sphere. It explains the fixation on philanthropy and the great worry about communication between slaves and abolitionists. Okay, now we move just a couple years further in time. And the year 1791 is an auspicious year in Haitian politics. So the Haitian Revolution, or the thing that we now know as the Haitian Revolution, starts off as a series of well-planned slave revolts in 1791. And at this point, of course, a lot of the fears and paranoias of the colonists become actualized. So the things that they were afraid of are now real. There has been a revolution, or there is a revolution undergoing right now. And so if you think back to that, what I said about the ambivalence of paranoia before, the scene is now a bit different. So a lot of that ambivalence is relieved by the fact that the object of paranoia has come to exist. So you're no longer afraid that something might happen. It's now been confirmed to happen. You were afraid that there could be a slave revolt. Well, there is a slave revolt. The colony's in uproar. There is massive unrest across Saint-Domingue, the French colony. And as a result, some of the things that the paranoid person was oscillating between no longer are possibilities. Okay, so now it just is the case that you've discovered what's going to happen. So now you know, you know, in fact, there was reason for fear. You know how things are turning out, namely that the French are losing their hold on the colony. And so the only thing that's really left in this paranoid mindset is the potential consolation of having been right. So there was a kind of ambivalence earlier. You said, I'd really rather be wrong. I'd rather not have been justified in my fear, but it turns out now I am justified in my fear. So I want to take consolation, at least in saying I foresaw the danger. I was correct in my paranoia. Now, my read on this is the psychology of it changes slightly. So we're no longer ambivalent so much as there's now a kind of a feeling of self-congratulatory confirmation. So now the imagination, that object of imagination, the phantasmatic public sphere, is very firmly fixed in people's minds. And they now want to use it as an explanation for why the revolution happened. So they want to at least have been right, to be afraid of the abolitionists and their potential connection to the slaves. And so now the move becomes one to discover evidence that you were right. And again, remember, there's still, as I've said, there's still no real concrete evidence that there are abolitionists in the colonies. There's no evidence that the enslaved people of the colonies have access to abolitionist writings. So this is all still very hypothetical. It's very up in the air. The people who were worried about revolution now want to at least have been right that it was the abolitionists they should be afraid of. And so you see that in the archives after the start of the revolution. So for instance, here we have, this is the kind of main newspaper of Saint-Domingue at this time, the Moniteur Général. It's kind of the most authoritative newspaper of record at the time. If you look closely, the first issue of that paper, the first page, they devote the entire front page to a poem, which is not something newspapers normally do these days, but this is 1791. The poem, it's a little hard to read because there's an archive stamp right on top of it, on top of the title. Whoops, sorry, just zooming in. The poem is called Ode à la Philanthropie, so Ode to Philanthropy. And of course, ode is usually a form of praise. This is a form of very, very strident condemnation. So I'm not going to translate the whole thing for you. As you can see, it's long. It continues on to the second page, but I'll just give you a taste of this. So this is part of Ode to Philanthropy. What a crowd of rebels rapturously close to carnage. The slave in his cruel hands carries fire and death. Stop, parricidal tool. An invisible and perfidious arm leads you to a frightful reversal. And the only fruit of so many crimes will be to mourn your victims under the weight of your new chains. Ferocious and bloody mania, I recognize you by your traits under the name philosophy. Okay, so again, the rhetoric is very strong here. Now, there's a crowd of rebels close to carnage, and these are identified as slaves, carrying fire and death, committing crimes, in this case, against the plantations. Now, what's responsible for this? Philosophy. Okay, so it is not the justified anger of people who have been enslaved and had violence committed on them or anything like that. It's philosophy. And if you were in any doubt about what philosophy is being referred to here, remember the poem is called Ode to Philanthropy. So it's abolition. Okay, abolition is the cause of this carnage, this chaos. Another example. This is actually a broadsheet. So it's a giant poster. It's probably a meter square. I actually had to stand on a chair to take a picture of this. So again, this is from the French Colonial Archives in Aix-en-Provence. And this is a chart that was published to be posted in a public area, listing all of the sugar plantations that had been burned during the first month of the revolution. And as you can see, it's a long list. So each of these is a plantation that had been burned down during the revolution. So fire was one of the chief weapons of the early part of the revolution. And in other words, this is a condemnation. It's a condemnation of the revolution. It's a condemnation of the damage that's occurring. And at the bottom, if you look at the very bottom, you see there's large print at the bottom. And I'll just zoom in on this. It says, "Their Frenchmen are the effects that the writings of the Amis des Noirs produced." Okay, and remember again, the Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of Blacks, is the group that Blisso founded. in France. So what's responsible for all this damage? I mean, one might be tempted to say, a revolution of slaves. No, it's the abolitionists. It's the Amis des Noirs that's being blamed here. So again, the rhetoric it's very strong, and it focuses on philanthropy. Another example, Felix Carlto was one of these white colonists who fled the colony during the revolution, and then wrote a very famous and widely circulated memoir of his experiences during the revolution. And again, it's a very strong indictment of the revolution itself, but specifically of abolitionists. So Carlto says, during the revolution, as the slaves were revolting, he saw the writings of Raynal, so that 10-volume work that I was talking about earlier. He says the slaves had that. He says sailors, French sailors, were secretly distributing abolitionist books and pamphlets to the slaves. And he says this was because they were working side by side on the docks, loading and unloading cargo. And a lot of the sailors were sympathetic to abolition, and so they were spreading these revolutionary doctrines to the slaves that they were working with. And so in this book, it's called Soirée Bermudienne, he says, few slaves knew how to read, but it took only one in the workshop who could read to the others when the conspiracy was forming to reveal how much protest there was in France and how many people there wanted them to throw off the harsh yoke of their pitiless masters. As for the engravings, it was only necessary to open one's eyes to understand the interpretation of the subject. Now, you might ask again, so the slaves are reading these books, they're reading the pamphlets, they're finding these engravings. Where did those come from? The answer is the Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of Black, Brisso's group. And Carlto is very harsh whenever he talks about the Amis des Noirs. The infernal sect of the Amis des Noirs, the gangrene of a false and partial philosophy that so corrupted the intellect of the entire empire. Their goal is to humiliate, persecute, and destroy those same whites, plunder their fortune, uproot their lives, overthrow their towns, and burn their edifices and houses. You will see this perfidious sect finally raise its abominable mask and bring about, along with the general liberty of the slaves, the complete annihilation of the colony. What a boiling school of insurrection. Very strong words, right? So Carlto is very clear that he's blaming the abolitionists and calling for this boiling school of insurrection, this revolution that's happening. And so all of these things, again, the various things I've looked at and many, many more that I'm not including here, I would say are examples of this attempt to explain the revolution by means of abolition. So it's the abolitionists who caused the revolution, and they caused it through the phantasmatic public sphere. Okay, so let me draw all of this together into some conclusions. So remember earlier I talked about these four figures that kind of populate this imaginary scene that the colonists have created for themselves. And so here I'm just taking those four figures on the left side of this chart. And I would like to go back to the theme of subaltern silence that I started with at the beginning. So this, again, is very much the subject of the book. It is the inspiration that I draw from Gayatri Spivak. So the silent slave, as the name indicates, is a classic example of subaltern speech that's silenced. And I've been clear about this already. So enslaved people in French colonialism were silenced through violence and law. Now, here's where things get interesting, and you see some of the subtleties of Spivak's ideas. So the European abolitionists try to rectify this situation. The slaves cannot speak, so the abolitionists try to speak on their behalf. They condemn slavery as an institution. They fight for its abolition. But in Spivak's terms, this is still problematic. And it's problematic in the sense that the abolitionists are speaking on behalf of people who cannot speak. And that creates this epistemic problem. It's a displacement of subaltern speech. So the very effort to speak on behalf of someone else creates the potential for misunderstanding, misrepresentation, occlusion, or simply ignoring what the subaltern might have wanted to say. Now, of course, there was no alternative, right? The subaltern could not speak. But it's important to realize that the abolitionists didn't necessarily have the right answer either. So they were speaking on behalf of someone else. And that's the problem that Spivak would point out. So both of these are classic examples of subaltern silence on Spivak's criteria. Okay, now think about the phantasmatic public sphere. It imagines counterfactually a situation in which subaltern speech is not silenced, where there's discourse, where there's a domain of discourse, but it's unknown and unknowable. So this is a whole different kind of subaltern silence. It's supposing there is speech, but we don't know about it and we can't know about it. And then it's, again, supposing that scenario and fearing it. Okay, so it's very hypothetical, it's very counterfactual, and it's a kind of reversal of the normal situation where what we're afraid of is people have been silenced. Here, what we're afraid of is they may be speaking. Okay, and therefore we reach this fourth figure, the incitable, potentially insurgent slave. And here again, there's a kind of reversal of subaltern silence. So the fear is there is some sort of conspiracy going on where the slaves are speaking. They're speaking to people in ways that are hidden from us, and they're speaking of dangerous ideas, but we cannot know about that. Okay. Now, that again is a form of subaltern silence. But notice there's something even more important here, which is the idea that it's the abolitionists who are the prime drivers, the prime agents in this activity. And so what that means is the Europeans are seen as the real revolutionaries, not the former slaves. In other words, this is a very striking form of subaltern silence, where the people who are actually conducting the revolution are still seen as not responsible. It's still seen as a European story, a European project. And so you see then those forms of subaltern silence that I just talked about are essentially connected as transformations through history. So these are the four, you might want to call them the four forms of silence connected with the four figures, but they unroll through time in this critical history that I'm telling. Okay, so this is really a set of transformations in the way people are subordinated, and you can see it has lots of twists and turns. So things change. There are moves and counter moves in this story, and in the end, what we wind up with is even a kind of further move in the context of subaltern silence, namely the idea that Europeans are the real revolutionaries. Okay, so let me just draw some conclusions from this. As I just said, the phantasmatic public sphere creates a new form of subaltern silence. It's the form of subaltern silence that says European abolitionists are the real agents in this revolution. And I think that's due to the fact that the colonists, their opponents, couldn't imagine slaves as revolutionary agents. So the real instigators are thought to be other Europeans. Now, this, of course, brings back silence in a new form. It strips the real revolutionaries of their agency. So even though they had conducted a successful revolution, or they would have by 1804, they're effectively denied voice. Now, second set of conclusions. The phantasmatic public sphere, this thing that I've been trying to unearth from the archives, represents a fear of failure to silence the subaltern. So again, this is a very interesting new twist, a new form of subaltern silence, different from the one Spivak talks about. It's a fear of unknowable and dangerous speech. It inverts concerns about subaltern speech. So rather than worrying about how could we help the subaltern to speak, this is a concern about failures to silence them. Now, third, the apparent silence of the subaltern here is an ominous sign in the mind of the paranoid colonist, because it could be a result of unknowability rather than subordination. And so the ambiguity and the unknowability of subaltern speech become a source of fear. Ultimately, then, the thing that I'm really interested in here is the ways in which the phantasmatic public sphere reveals the ambiguities of presence, agency, and speech that silence the subaltern. So it's that new form of subaltern silence that I'm most interested in. And with that, I'll wrap up the presentation. I'll be very eager for your feedback and your comments. So thank you.
Thank you for your insightful presentation, Kevin. And so please, if anyone wants to ask a question, just write down in the chat. And I'll just start with a few comments and a couple questions. I had 3 questions, but I'll start with a couple and then move on to other questions.
Great.
So I found the presentation very interesting, and you have a very ambitious project of finding, and I totally agree with the way you read Spivak, and I thought it was my fault, but that she has this very insightful elements running through the book, but the lack of a broader, wider approach to diagnosing subalternity. So I agree with the way you read her. But listening to your presentation, I was going back to the broader question about the meaning of subalternity and connecting the elements of this specific chapter to the broader argument. And I was curious about one of the elements of the discussion. You often mention that the fear and the paranoia was that the silent slave became the agent, the speaking person that conducts a revolutionary process. But it seems that the key element of subalternity is still here, which is the impossibility of acknowledging agency in itself. So I'm not sure if it's the fear of the silent slave starting to speak, or if it's the fear that that the abolitionists are speaking on behalf of them, because they're not considered to be subjects. And then I don't know if I'm being entirely clear, but my point is, at some points you seem to mention this fear about the possibility of speaking, and in Spivak, the impossibility of the subaltern to speak is related to the impossibility of being considered, of being heard. And in what we were discussing, you seem to find exactly the same thing, that the fear in itself is not of the revolution of the slaves or of what they might speak if they listen to this phantasmatic public sphere, but it's the fear of the European speaking. So it's they are still out of the picture, and not because they cannot speak, but because they cannot be heard, which is related to what Spivak considers about the impossibility of speaking. Mm-hmm. So that's my, I don't know if I made myself clear, but that's my first question, which is related to my second question. And I wonder, how does this concept of phantasmatic public sphere speak to contemporary politics and to contemporary critical theory? So do you see, in the spirit of critical theory, of understanding key phenomena in order to imagine or other possible worlds, or So how would you apply this idea of a phantasmatic public sphere to interpret current politics? Is it this imagination of the roots of fear that in a certain way leads us to project and to imagine depolarization, which denies the possibility of speaking and of actually meeting otherness in the public sphere? So how would you apply this idea to think about current phenomena?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think this may take the rest of our time, actually. Those are great questions. I think the first one involves a certain amount of complexity. So let me answer that one first while I can remember it. So I think you're right that there's a kind of a sense in which the people who are afraid of philanthropy can't imagine the subaltern speaking in that narrow sense of speech. And this is why it was very important for me at the beginning to point out that for Spivak, even the way she uses the concept, can the subaltern speak, is always a metaphor, right? Or it's not strictly a metaphor, but it encompasses a wide variety of things. And so one of the difficulties that I've found in this book, and it's the reason I talk ultimately about silence rather than speech, is it's very hard to say what you mean here using at least the vocabulary that's available to me. So there's this sort of sensorial vocabulary, right? So what we talk about is speech, audibility, visibility. But what we really mean is comprehension, presence. Do you understand people in society, as you said, as agents, as subjects, as having something meaningful to say, or as doing something that's meaningful? And so I think that, in other words, if you stop thinking about speech in the narrow sense and think about it much more broadly, which is what I try to do in the chapters before this in the book, there's a sense in which revolutionary activity is speech, right? It's making yourself unavoidable. So, and notice, of course, this is always the register that they describe their fear in. So the philanthropists are writing these horrible things. And that's fine, you know, I mean, to some extent, if that's all that ever happened, they wouldn't worry about it. But what they're afraid of is all those other things that were being described, right? Carnage, murder, mayhem. And of course, those are the actions of the slaves in revolution. And so what I want to say is, and this is, I think, something, it's an argument that I would have to have with Spivak. But I want to say that's a form of presence, at least, right? And it's here I'm kind of tempted to start sounding like Hannah Arendt, and I don't want to have to do that. So, but it's, you know, Arendt talks about, you know, the domain of appearances, right? So the world that we share in common. And I think one way to look at the problem of subaltern speech is people are pushed out of that shared world, right? They don't appear there. And so burning down the plantation is a great way to make yourself appear, right? And I think that's part of what people are afraid of. So there's that. There's an additional part, though, which is the legitimacy that's attached to speech even if you succeed in speaking, right? And this would apply to actions as well. So are you entitled to be listened to? Do the things you say or do have any value? And I think that's also part of this struggle. And here's where it's really valuable. You know, I actually started in the 1760s and go all the way up to the 1860. So this kind of broad period of history, and you see all of these things play out. So the kinds of action that the subaltern manages to engage in changes. And then there's also changes in the way that's evaluated by the dominant society. Okay. And so I think that's really what I'm interested in here. And so I see the fear as an acknowledgement that there might be forms of action that we would have to acknowledge as speech in some sense. Okay, now your question, I'm really, really glad you asked the question about Frankfurt School, because there is a version of this book which is not the one I wrote. There would be a systematic point-by-point rebuttal of Jürgen Habermas's Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which was a deeply influential book for me ever since graduate school. And it was actually the original, the dissertation project I wanted to write and I never wrote. And so that book has always been very important for me. And what I'm doing, actually, if you look at the archives I'm reading, it's the same time period as Habermas. So Habermas, from the archives of the 18th and 19th century, draws these lessons about the importance of public discourse, the ways in which people can use discourse as a kind of a weapon of democracy, a vector of democratization. And I want to say, not so fast, okay? And it's not just not so fast in a kind of ad hoc sense. What I'm trying to do is go back into the same history and say, in 1764, the first newspaper was published in the Caribbean colonies. Within a week, it became a tool of domination, right? It spent 6 days as a tool of democratization, and then on the 7th day, it became a tool of domination. At that point, its subscription rate increased dramatically. Clearly, people were very interested in the dominating force, the dominating capabilities of this new public print technology. And so to some extent, what I'm trying to do here is say the public sphere has a lot of dangers. And the dangers I'm looking at, because it's a colonial history, they have everything to do with racialization and subordination. So, if we think that public discourse and public reason are the solution to a lot of problems, we have to be very careful, because we have to acknowledge that deeply implicated within that is great danger. And so what I'm trying to show, the book actually ends where I think the danger becomes fully realized. But I never really say, okay, this is about the public sphere, but I'm glad you heard that anyway. I just don't, the book is already long and complicated enough, and I didn't want to have to get into this discussion with Habermas as well, but that's very much there. So wonderful question.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 more questions. Would it be okay if we just collect them, the 3 of them?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so Julia is the first one.
One moment that I wrote that question, I was taking a lot of notes, and so I read here. I would like to take the opportunity to ask a slightly more transversal question about your work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a master's student, and in my research, I had contact with your book of Imagined Sovereignties.
Great.
In that book, you bring a very interesting concept of normativity. In that book, working as certain ideas, such as that of popular sovereignty, have a mandatory character, to which you confront the idea to bring critical reflections to denaturalize this mandatory place and eventually get to know this imaginary better. And I think that my question here is a little bit equal to the first of Ricardo, because here in your presentation, I get curious of knowing better the dynamics in the relation between imagination, imaginary, and normativity. Because you bring that in your presentation, the confirmation of that paranoid, the self-congratulation confirmation. Does this operate in the construction of an imaginary? How imagination relates to imaginary in a normative way. So this, I got curious to better comprehend this dynamics of relations between imagination, imaginary, and in a post moment, the normativity, how this idea get to be to this force character. And if you could also explain better your idea of normativity, I would like to understand better if you think it's appropriate.
Yeah, great. That's wonderful. Thank you for, I guess I hadn't thought, I'm so busy writing the book, I hadn't thought about how it relates to some of my other things, but that's really great. So the idea of normativity in imagined sovereignties in the other book from 2016, I mean, it's very much the idea. I mean, so that book is, if I could be honest for a moment, nobody's listening, right? I'll just say that it grew out of a kind of boredom with democratic theory. That I really got sick of being in discussions, particularly in political science, over and over and over again, where you start with democracy and then go forward. And so the idea is, you know, democracy is this sort of taken for granted value, or it's a historical inevitability. And so we'll just start with that and assume it's good. And then the question is, how can we best realize it? In what form can we best realize it? And so Imagined Sovereignties was really an attempt to use this same kind of critical history, you know, genealogy, to talk about democracy. And essentially what I wanted to say about it is, if you look at the actual beginnings of democratic politics, and again, you know, it's a similar time period, right? So the 18th and 19th century, what you see is the creation of a bunch of ideas about sovereignty and how politics should be, in other words, normativity, right? So the kind of normative notion of politics, you see the creation of those ideas, and they have a very practical importance. They're created in a sort of a history. And so, I mean, I didn't tell the full story because it's an enormous history, right? It would involve, you know, half the planet. But what I did was look at a very particular kind of iconic part of the French Revolution. So I think that's chapter 4, and basically make the argument that what you see people trying to do is, there's a normativity in monarchy, which is very simple, right? So the king is a unified agent. The king has sovereign authority and unity as one person. But then the question was, how do you take that basic normative ideal, which is, it's then called sovereignty by analogy to the sovereign. So that's the normative core of politics. How do you turn that into democratic politics? And my answer was, you can watch it happening, and it never worked very well. So basically, it's this kind of very complicated, fraught process where people are trying to come up with an analogy to the unified agency and sovereignty of the king. And then they say, well, it's the people, or it's the public, or, you know, it's a fraction of the public, or it's a representative assembly. And so those are all normative ideas, right? They're analogies to the rule of the king. They're ideas about how politics should be organized. So that's really what I kind of mean by normativity there. Now, it's really interesting to ask that in terms of this material. I mean, if you're familiar with Imagined Sovereignties, you can see where this book is coming from. Basically, it comes from the last 2 chapters, or the 6th and 7th chapter of that book, which are also about Haitian colonialism. And the thing I'm interested in, but it's a very different subject. And so what I'm interested in there is the idea of the way, like I said, the value that's often attached to particular identities and particular kinds of people. And that's also normative, right? It doesn't use the category of sovereignty. It uses a category that I would characterize as legitimacy. So who's legitimate, and whose actions and whose speech are legitimate. But I think there's that thread continues. Now, the idea of the construction of imaginaries is, I think it's also sort of exactly what I'm doing in this other book. I don't talk about it as much, but it's the construction of a racist imaginary and a colonial imaginary that renders people invisible. And by imaginary, so I've been talking about imagination here, and that's kind of a more general concept. When I talk about imaginary, I'm talking about a shared system of belief that's not fully articulated, potentially highly contradictory. Okay, so Cornelius Castoriadis is kind of my example of that. So yeah, that's a great question. Ricardo, I realized you said you wanted to collect the questions and I just started talking. So I'm sorry, I'll be quiet.
Don't worry. So let's move to the next one. Lucas?
Good afternoon, Professor Olson. Thanks for the great presentation. It certainly seems a book that I want to read cover to cover. It seems to me that the phantasmatic public sphere is a concept that is very provocative for the standpoint of the heuristic value of the concept and the reverberation of the theme to our current context. But my question is a methodological question. If I understand correctly, you apply a interpretative methodology of genealogical research, which brings me back to Foucault. However, as Gilles Deleuze proposed, Foucault's genealogy seems to have some challenges to be faced, so that the work of the genealogist does not become a work of a structuralist archivist. From my point of view, I see that the Foucaultian genealogy would have some minimal goals and challenges, like suspicions of grand narratives, single cause for historical changes, and value-laden teleologies of progress. It's the story of the small and multiple changes that lead to alterations in trends of thinking and operations of power in a given epoch. In this sense, I would like to hear you. What were your challenges to build a genealogical interpretation of your phenomenon without being an archivist? In this sense, thank you.
We have two more questions. Would you like us to collect them, or would you like to respond?
Maybe, I mean, the questions are so great and complex. Maybe I should just try to respond.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be efficient. No, I mean, again, your questions are all wonderful. This is great. Yes, so there are huge methodological challenges here, which is one of the most interesting parts of this project for me. And the chief challenge is this, that if you think about Foucault's genealogies, they tend to be generated out of literatures, right? So there's a kind of intellectual history that he's tracing. And then, you say various things about the way that intellectual history is connected, or it changes, or there's ruptures and so on. What I'm talking about is a much more complicated social situation. So it's not just textual. And the texts are often odd kinds of things. They're pamphlets, they're broadsheets. If we had more time, I would have showed you a bunch of engravings, actually, because Felix Carlto referred to engravings. So there's a whole visual component of this as well. Then there's accounts of actions. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is talk about the ways in which the construction of various meanings occurs in this very broad context. But here's the problem. The topic is subaltern silence, right? So this is a genealogy of something that by definition does not exist. And so what I have to do is work around the edges of that. So how given, okay, so if the silence is a silence, what are the points of access interpretively and archivally to that? And so if you kind of went back and looked through the presentation, this is what I'm doing is I don't want to say, well, okay, there's nothing we can say about this, it's silence. That's kind of some of Spivak's interpreters read her that way, that just, well, throw up your hands and say, by definition, there's nothing to say here. Part of what I want to say is genealogically, if you look over time, there's a lot you can say because it shows you where the edges of those silences are. It shows you where they fail, where they're contested, how they're constructed, right? But there's always that problem. You're writing about something that by definition doesn't exist. And so that's been a continual source of conscience for me, but also, you know, I find it a very interesting challenge. So yeah, bravo. Now, of course, what happens then is the genealogy that's produced is not, you know, a linear story of progress. It's boop, 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 you know, kind of all over the place, but not in the same way as Spivak. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest is when things change or shift, they do so for particular reasons. But it's a very discontinuous history with lots of innovation. So thank you. Yeah.
Felipe Esdras. Seu microfone está fechado ainda, Felipe.
Can you hear me now? Good afternoon, Professor. It's a pleasure having you here, as everyone has said before me. I'm very impressed about your talk and the biography, also the authors that you brought to us today. And I'm despite all of them, I'm very interested about the point of views. I have a question that comes to my try to make something in my final work here. And when I think about the normativity that you brought to us, I was thinking how agents is so important for political science. And I think mainly in all of his studies, also when you think about this Spivak, Butler, they are always trying to explain how to make agents out of this kind of population. I don't know if I can say population of people, but this kind of subaltern people, as you told before. And my really concern about it is if I can think about the subalterns and in a different way of the mainstream of the political science, and when they have someone to talk to for them, or in their name, I could say that, or if I can try, like Butler, try to restructure it, make in the new way to try to make a political theory and talk about vulnerability, for example, and in this way make connection in a different way, of course, of Taylor and Fraser, but somehow understanding that you don't need to make agents to understand that it is still a politic issue, a politic demand. That's my attempt here to make a question more than that, a dialogue to understand your point of view better about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, and I think, I mean, that, you know, if you think about it, it's great that you bring those other authors into this discussion, right? Because, I mean, to some extent, what Spivak is trying to criticize is a potential romanticism about agency, right? And the project, you know, of essentially finding subaltern subjects to liberate, right? And of course, you know, people like Judith Butler, Nancy Fraser, or Charles Taylor, or for that matter, the subaltern studies people in India, they're not quite so explicit about it. But Spivak sees that as a kind of, you know, this progressive post-structuralist project that a lot of people conceive their research to be an alliance between the intellectual and the oppressed. And she wants to say, not so fast, right? So there are significant problems with the idea that you could speak on behalf of the oppressed or the subordinated or liberate them or give them voice, right? And so instead, as we were just discussing, those become methodological problems, right? So the question is, you can't simply go and say, I found an oppressed people, I'm going to speak the truth of their oppression and now they're free. Because Spivak shows you how sort of potentially dangerous that motive is in itself, right? And of course, what this means is interpretively, you're always kind of tied up in knots when you're doing this work. The way I like to frame it is I'm kind of operating both from Foucault and Spivak at the same time and trying to, take on board the insights of both of them. But Spivak criticizes Foucault of that sort of romanticism as well. And so what I've settled on instead of, liberating the subaltern is simply to point out the structures of subordination, right? So it's a criticism of the ways in which that people can be subordinated. I'm not saying, here are the people that I'm liberating, right? So I think essentially I'm agreeing with you, right? That I think it's a very important caution in this kind of work.
Okay, and thank you. Our very last question by João Paulo.
So may I? So I will follow my colleagues and praise your very interesting talk. It provides really value insight for us. And my question, it revolves around if I'm able to apply your findings to another level of analysis. Say international relations, for example. For instance, what strikes me most was your finding that Europeans, they basically claim they were legitimate agents or the only agents to raise grievance on behalf of colonized societies. So basically, I'm wondering is it possible, in your opinion, for example, or if you could stretch more on this, if it's possible to apply this understanding to international discussions about terrorism or human rights, because as far as I'm concerned, they are global issues, but only great powers, only developed industrial powers held sway over those issues that are considered and legitimized as international aspects, but they are based on their own understandings.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely applies at those levels. And here, I guess I have to say one thing, which is, and I said this briefly when we were talking about abolitionism. You can criticize the abolitionists for trying to speak on behalf of the subaltern. On the other hand, history would have been very different if they hadn't, right? So that was quite necessary in its way, and I think it actually did have some sort of causal impact on allowing people the ability to revolt. In other words, I think there was a kind of destabilizing influence on French colonialism as a result. And so if you look at the things you were talking about, international human rights, responsibility to protect, various things that come up under the heading of international relations, they're controversial for exactly the same reasons, right? So they're attempts to act on behalf of other people, which can be both very good and potentially quite dangerous. And so I think what I would say is the message is not don't do that. The message is always be careful, right? That you have to have these cautions kind of in the back of your mind. So certainly, I'll say some of my own graduate students who've gone on to international relations and actually sort of NGO work or government work, I'm always glad that they have this background, right? Because they're much less likely to be kind of intellectually and culturally imperialistic in the way they deal in those contexts. You might still need to act in certain ways, but you have to kind of have cautions in the back. So, an international actor who's read Gayatri Spivak, I think, is better than one who hasn't. You know, I would put it that way. So it's kind of everything is dangerous is basically the slogan here. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming to the end. So I would like to thank you very much for your time, for your presentation, for your insights and ideas. It was a great pleasure to listen to you and to talk to you here. If there is anything else you'd like to add, or just tell us when the book is coming out, if there is a time frame, or
boy, no, that's
looking forward to read it.
Now things are getting ugly. You know, as I said, the manuscript is fully written, and I can't resist the temptation to play with it. And of course, you know, marvelous feedback like you've given me today causes me to think about it even more. So, you know, thank you very much for these wonderful questions. You're delaying the progress on the book because now I have to go rethink what I'm doing. But I'm hoping, you know, who knows, in the next year, hopefully it'll be out at some point. And I just want to thank all of you for the wonderful questions and for coming and discussing this with me. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you, Ricardo, for the invitation too. This is really a pleasure.